Of all the elections taking place in 2024, few will be quite like the Indian election. The poll was the world's largest exercise in democracy, with more than 640 million votes cast over 6 weeks. Quite apart from the scale of the election, the stakes could not have been much higher. For many commentators, it was no less than the future of Indian democracy at stake at the ballot box. When results started coming through the first week of June, many of those same commentators said that Indian democracy had won a great victory. Incumbent Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was widely tipped to win a landslide victory that would enable him to pursue his populist agenda, managed to stay in power thanks to his coalition partners. But his Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, fell well short of winning the absolute majority that had been predicted. So, where does India stand going forward? Was this election really a death blow for Modi's brand of populist politics? Joining me to discuss that question is Professor Shruti Kapila of Cambridge University. Professor Kapila was born and raised in India, and India's democracy and constitution have remained the core of her research interests. Her most recent book, Violent Fraternity: Indian Political Thought in the Global Age, was described as an innovative and original study that embodies the fresh and bold scholarship that is redrawing the intellectual map of the world. She has also recently been made OBE in the recent King's Birthday honors in the UK. Welcome to the lead, Shruti.
Thank you, Surabhi. It's great to be on the podcast with you here today.
So, as we mentioned in the introduction, ahead of the elections, many people were saying that they would be crucial for the future of Indian democracy, given the continuing monopolization of Modi and the BJP, and the increasing control they had over institutions in the media. So, how much do you agree with the idea that Modi's failure to win a decisive majority means that Indian democracy has been saved?
I certainly think it is a vote for democracy. And I think I'll say that first up ahead why crucially it is. Because I think there was this kind of inevitability written by not just exit polls and but or not just the mainstream media, but very much the way Modi himself has kind of fashioned his rule, that there will be a kind of like a long-term plan. Even in his interviews, he spoke about it as a kind of not just overdoing or overcoming or equalizing Jawaharlal Nehru's record of being, India's founding prime minister and the longest serving prime minister, who served for three consecutive terms and died in office. And it's really his record that Modi has equaled in a kind of broken way. But his the campaign was all about that this was a so-called new India. So if Nehru had kind of founded an independent India, that had been also done on the back of his kind of long-term popularity and consensus politics that he had run, then Modi had very much fashioned himself as someone who was creating and founding a new identity for India, and that he was asking for votes. And we will break down what that new India was, or is rather. And the idea was that he would need a much longer mandate, or that he was someone who was going to stay in power up until 2047, but was not him in power, but his vision was all for 2047, which is India's 100th independence year. So one is really the time frame with which he operated, and which meant that there was an inevitability of the way in which the narrative had been initially constructed. But secondly, I think it seemed, or certainly if you only read the Indian media, that there was no opposition, that this was a very popular prime minister. He had like very high approval ratings, despite COVID, despite high inflation, despite high joblessness. This was somehow yet a prime minister who was held in such high esteem that there was no kind of, as it were, really, there was no questioning that his popularity might have suffered in the intervening years. So I think initially, if you were just part of reading just the Indian media, then you would have thought that this was a shocker of a result. And this was a shocker of a result because his own slogan of 400 par or 400 plus was also asking for a brute two-thirds majority of the Indian Parliament, and that is not just a kind of conceit. The number is really crucial because you need two-thirds majority. Say, unlike the American case, you need two-thirds majority to change the constitution. So the Indian Constitution is rewritable, unlike the American Constitution, and therefore you needed that mandate. Now, all these things that he thought were going in his favor were precisely the things that began to come undone over the long campaigning season. And so I think first and foremost, yes, India kind of has halted, if not thwarted, that kind of very strong man populism, that authority ridden way of doing politics. And we will talk a little bit more whether that is actually the case or not. But his mandate certainly has broken the spell of Modi as infallible. It's That's not the case. He's going to have to work with a large number of coalition partners. His power is very fragile, even though he remains prime minister.
I've heard you raise this idea in multiple platforms that Modi wanted to make this a plebiscite on his personality, but the verdict instead ended the singularity of his rule. And a lot of us in the media and otherwise have been saying that the results have humbled him. So, what do you think Modi's third term would mean for him? He has really been cut to size?
Uh, well, his mandate certainly has been cut to size. Time will tell whether his personality and his style of rule has been cut to size. Because if you look at what has happened on the 8th of 9th of June, like 10 days ago, when the new government is declared, and last week you've had the new cabinet, and lots of people expected, some form of change in the cabinet. But the cabinet is very much a continuity cabinet. Yeah. And Modi has worked incredibly hard, or is working incredibly hard, to convey the impression that it is still the same old Modi and the same old government, which is just, it's a continuity government. Right. But I think that is a more of, I would say, not spinning, but even if that was meant to be for real, it is going to be a very hard and tall ask for it to be the same. Because Modi is really, you just need one coalition partner to walk away and the government falls. And the two coalition partners that Modi is dependent on, the JDU in Bihar and also the Telugu Desam in Andhra Pradesh, for listeners, these are really important regional parties, one from southern India and one from northern India. And both the men whose regional parties that have, as it were, lent him support, at best have been politically flexible, which is to say that BJP and Modi, they both represent a big ideological project of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. Both these men are at their worst considered to be politically agnostic or flexible, that they will pursue power over any ideological project in the sense that they're supreme pragmatists. The other way to think about it would be that certainly in the case of Chandrababu Naidu of Telugu Desam in southern India, he has always had very secular credentials. So I think there is, by definition, there's going to be a kind of moderating influence on the coalition, or that is at least what is hoped. So all of this to say that Modi, who had prevailed so high in a parliamentary system for 10 years, he was synonymous with one man, one rule, that even seasoned journalists could not name you the full cabinet members. I mean, it was such a faceless government that there was only one figure who loomed large and maybe a couple of others. And now, even I am sort of trying to impart information about two people, from southern and northern India, saying, well, actually, these are not just the kingmakers, but they now are going to be holding Modi, not if not to account to power, but Modi is going to have to placate them at the very least. So, why are they important? I think let's explain that. India, of course, has a parliamentary system. You have about 550, 60 odd plus MPs elected. It's actually someone, again, it's a very large country with, a billion people were eligible to vote. And so the constituencies, there are 550 odd constituencies. For which parliament he is responsible for. And you need 272 a number is what constitutes a parliamentary majority. And what is fascinating is that Modi fell way short of that. His party has got about 240, and they had on their own about 303 the previous government time. So, which is to say that they needed to make up those numbers with coalition partners from other parties. And India has a multi party system. It's not like an American system, it's not simply bipartisan. It has two national parties and 30 odd other regional parties. And so he's picked two major allies from two different bits of India who are making up, as it were, the coalition. And I think also, I should say that again, for much more for American listeners, though this would be very well known to anyone in India, but also from Italy, actually, coalition governments have been ruling India for a long time. That it actually symbolizes and represents competition in India's democratic fabric. In fact, Modi's 10-year rule was a kind of, you could say, turn up for the books, because up until then, for the previous 30 years, India had only had coalition governments. And this is why I think Modi's rule has, in the last 10 years, has not only been, I wouldn't want to use simply the word authoritarian or autocratic, it was also disruptive of the negotiation that has gone in with different contending stakeholders in India's political system, which coalitions represented. He's also been now forced to play and behave like any other Indian politician. So he's been cut to size because he's now going to have to sit on the table and negotiate with other partners who will demand things in return for their support, which is really a challenge for him. It's not a challenge for other Indian politicians, because, as I was saying, that other Indian politicians are very accustomed to working in coalitions and partnerships because that has been the habit of their rule. But in both roles, he has had absolute majority and authority over the legislature to push his agenda. So he knows that he's under test, that people are watching him, which is why part of the reason the cabinet remains pretty much unchanged from, at least in the front bench, remains unchanged from the previous two governments almost, is because he wants to convey, yes, it's business as usual. Look, I'm just going to carry on. I am still in charge. I am still in control. It's early days, it's early days. We'll find out. But as I said, the numbers will make that logic quite difficult. It will be quite a fragile. It's quite a fragile combination.
Yes, right. So we can say that coalition governments are good for the
Well, I
Indian
mean,
democracy.
I mean, I wouldn't give a judgment, but I would say they're a more equitable, democratic form of power in India, precisely because it is such a diverse country. And it is not a presidential system, unlike the American one. I think this kind of the checks and balances which were expected from other organs of government, which have been, nearly absent in the last 10 years, or that is what at least analysts and even people like myself are thinking, will now be given by the political stakeholders who are who are sitting with him in government.
Right. But one of Modi's more divisive projects was to build the Ram Temple on the site of the demolished Babri Mosque, which our former guest Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay warned could herald like the emergence of a new form of political Hinduism. Given that Modi and the BJP actually lost in the constituency of the Ram Temple, how do you think Modi's Hindu nationalist project stands now?
I do think this vote was a very symbolically important, potent one. Ayodhya, Faizabad, which is where the Babri Mosque was, which was also torn down by Hindu nationalist mobs in 1992. And really, the rise of the BJP as a national electoral force is entirely related to the cause of the Ram Temple. Because that's really in the 90s, then they start gaining, as it were, electoral kind of power. And therefore, by the time you come to 2024, when Modi inaugurates the temple in Ayodhya, it is seen to be a moment of fulfillment of that grand project of Hindu nationalism, in which this Ram temple has replaced the mosque, which had been the sort of source of much contention, perhaps. But the idea was that this was going to be a victory lap. that this was going to deliver a kind of a massive mandate or a thank you from the electorate, because in Uttar Pradesh, or India's largest state, which is where this sits, where Hindu nationalism has been really, really important in forging its national footprint, is not voted in. And it's not just not voted in, it is instead votes in a Dalit, untouchable candidate from a lower caste party, which has been always socialist and has been, interested in the question of social equity and a wider coalition with Muslims. So that has been there, as it were, core constituency, the Samajwadi Party. And for that election in Ayodhya to be beaten by such a candidate tells you that the Hindu nationalist project, at the very heart, symbolic heart of its project, came undone. I'm not saying it's finished. I just think what it has done is that it has absolutely dented and thwarted the inevitability of a Hindu first India that many were, expecting or thinking that India was already on that path. And the Indian electorate, whether particularly in the Hindi heartland of Uttar Pradesh, have really given Modi the biggest shock in this election.
One of the highlights of this election was how the Dalits voted. And they are the most marginalized castes in the country, but they make a fifth of the national population. And many of them did vote for BJP in the past. But this election, we saw, even with Chandrasekhar Azad, him winning his seat. If you could talk us more about what do you see for the future of Dalit politics in the
I
country?
think it's very interesting, and I think there are two things to sort of alert again, to just to set it in context. I mean, India, of course, has multi parties, and as you rightly point out, Dalits, as Dr. Ambedkar, the founder of India's constitution, the writer of India's constitution, and as it were the kind of founding Dalit political leader and voice for modern India, he made very explicit that what kind of binds every Indian is the question of caste. That is for all its diversity, there is this commonality of untouchability that binds it. The problem was precisely what you say, that it is one fifth, it's all, every village, every town. That caste is an inescapable social reality, collective and individual and social. And yet, at least until very recently, it has struggled to find a kind of political valence in India. And I think you had the first big expression of Dalit politics in electoral terms. Of course, there had been political politics and mobilization and protests under the big party, the Bahujan Samaj Party, BSP. But I think now we can talk a little bit more about the Indian opposition, because this is not simply just an anti Modi vote. It is also the fact that for the last 3 years, the Indian opposition has found its voice. And it really has come up trumps in the sense because it really set the narrative. And Modi was on the back foot from day one after official campaigning started, because whether it was the politics of hate or whether it was a question of caste politics, the Indian opposition, which kind of had a rainbow coalition, but they decided not to get fragmented around different groups. So they put aside a lot of their sectional interests and put together actually a kind of strong coalition, which meant that the Dalit vote or the Muslim vote or even the vote of the jobless youth did not get fragmented, that it started kind of cohering and centralizing itself towards one candidate, which was ultimately the candidate opposed to Modi. For long, we've thought of the Indian Constitution as a really nice little document for liberal, posh liberals sitting in urban metropolitan centers arguing about the niceties of India's rights and so on. But here it was when you had when you had BJP leaders saying, "Well, please give us votes because we want to change the constitution." This was then very quickly relayed by the opposition that, look, your rights are under threat, and the constitution then becomes this very emotive point of attachment for the opposition campaign, and it's a total winner. And this is also for the opposition, and it also then allows for, I would say, the regrouping of Dalit politics towards a much more politics of equity and justice, rather than simply about, which government is going to just give us a slightly better deal. And so the BJP started losing a lot of its Dalit vote as well. The point of Ambedkar's project was that caste was not simply a social inequity, but rather it was a deeply political relationship. It was a relationship between upper caste and lower caste, which is not simply about, say, class or access to jobs. Of course, all of that was in it, but that foundationally, this had been possible because power and violence was associated with was had been structured in Indian society in such a way. And therefore, what you needed was to counter that, not by simply giving rights and quotas and creating some kind of equitable justice, which was partly also there, but to ensure that the idea of the Dalit became a political category, that it was in a political relationship with the Indian state. And I think that kind of assertion is back on, that it's not simply that you need parties who will look after Dalit interest, that they need to be, but that actually Dalit power in its own political right, in its own political way, will have to flourish. But these are leaders who are growing up. They're very young. They're all under 40, I would guess, if not much younger. And so they're really kind of responding in real time to Modi politics. So I think really interesting. And I think it's also very important that the main opposition party, the Indian National Congress, which had been fairly squeamish about reservations and caste census, and it had been liberal, but it had never really, in fact, it had lost its power to the rise of not just Hindu nationalism, but also through the assertion of caste politics, lower caste politics. And for them to have also, under Rahul Gandhi, to have repositioned themselves as part of a caste politics, demanding equity on the basis of caste, is also part of then the revival story for the Indian National Congress.
And yes, so you mentioned the Congress Party and Rahul Gandhi. They made a strong comeback this elections. Rahul won by big margins, and now his sister Priyanka Gandhi will be fighting the by-elections. So, what do you think the elections have told us about the Congress Party?
So I think Congress has definitely had a reincarnation. In a way, they've swapped. The Congress and the BJP have kind of swapped crises, because the BJP now looks like the old, tired, sprawling, factionalized party. Interestingly, the Congress, which was not seen to be a particularly ideologically sort of robust party, now is ideologically leaner. It knows what it stands for. It's radicalized some of its own origins in a way. It has returned to not just the Gandhi legacy, of course, but also a much more, as I said, incorporated and wanting to revive the Ambedkarite legacy and even the question of caste justice. So I think ideologically there's been a real remaking of the Congress. And most importantly, I think Rahul Gandhi's walk for the Bharat Jodo Yatra, which, initially when a lot of it started, I remember it was 2 years ago, people were very, very skeptical. And because they'd gotten accustomed to dismissing him as a dilettante, or if worst, a dynast, that no one took it seriously. There was a lot of that kind of aggressive emotional palette in India, in its collective thinking. And it began to change because people started talking. And of course, he himself set it up as a kind of narrative, a walk for unity, but also a walk for about love, but also a kind of trying to say, I'm going to walk because it's also an act of fearlessness. And he's made that point several times, that this has just been a very uneven election because all the institutions and agencies have been very much one-sided. And his point was that, well, when you have nothing, you just have to get up and walk, and you have to directly connect with the people. And that's kind of what Gandhi did with the Salt March. And so it was interesting. I mean, I'm not saying comparing it to the Salt March, but that was clearly the inspiration when you have a very, very powerful opponent. But actually, even I wrote at that point, it was a kind of very unpopular opinion at that time. But he had actually changed the imagery of politics very quickly, because everyone has thought of Modi as, his backstory was considered to be very much of our age. That, of course, the liberal establishment elite, they only promote their own. And there was Modi, who was the son of a tea stall owner from a lower caste and had risen to the top office against a kind of dynastic order. Right? I mean, that was the story, this age of anger where, across the world, that has happened to the established elite. And what was fascinating was that Rahul Gandhi 3 years ago emerged as someone who people could connect with. And that's because he did what Mahatma Gandhi did. That rather than actually just sitting on big rallies through grams, and through kind of really big campaigning style that Modi was doing, that the idea of walking across the country created a kind of immediate connection with people. And it was also less contrived. So it led to a lot of spontaneous conversations, women coming and crying, or various kind of people constantly talking about the difficulties of Indian economy. So there was a kind of new emotional language that he helped institute at that point. Because up until then, it was all anger, ressentiment, just resentment and anger and national pride, patriotism and nationalism. And you saw that soon after that, the first kind of state election after that, the federal election, Karnataka, was delivered to the Congress. And that was important because, it gave a kind of launch pad to the opposition to say, well, yes, actually, if we put our heads together, it might just work. And so it happened.
Yeah, many of us had written off the Congress party. They've had a long history. They've been the mainstay in Indian politics since India was formed. So, how would you describe the party, its identity, what it stands for at the moment?
I think definitely opposed to Hindu nationalism and authority, definitely opposed to the politics of authority and fear, and standing for India's diversity and federalism. Uh, and I think standing or revitalizing also the original political settlement of the Indian Constitution, which is made in the name of and done in the name of diversity and equity, right, and federalism. I think across the world, ideas like liberalism, they've lost their power, explanatory power, let alone power to identify with. So I do think there's a new kind of vocabulary emerging, political grammar emerging, which is not simply socialism, it's not simply populism, or it's not simply progressive populism, or that debate that is also being had, that is populism necessarily right wing? And how do non right wing parties globally, whether it's Trump, whether it's Bolsonaro, whether it's Turkey, whether it's India, how do you create an opposition, new kind of political language? The second thing with the Congress is that actually its own political structures, which had been almost too heavy, it had such a kind of heavy kind of party machinery, which seemed so factionalized and sprawling and ineffective at the same time. That seems to have gotten organized much better. It has a Dalit leader in Kharge as the president. And I think so. It's not simply about the family, I would say. I think Rahul Gandhi has emerged as an ideological pole for India, not simply for the party. He's now that face, given that in Uttar Pradesh, and again, he has now, beaten Modi as the potential prime ministerial candidate in popularity ratings. It must be a first because for at least 10 years, if not 15, he's just been dismissed as a dilettante or just a kind of a entitled kind of politician. And I think Congress has done something I'd not expected it to do, which was it used its loss of power to discover its core principles. So what does it actually stand for? And I think that's been, and the other, I think, and at a kind of more party level, organizational level, the generational shift has happened. And I don't mean just with the Gandhi siblings. If you look at Haryana, if you look at Maharashtra, if you look at Gujarat, there's a whole slew of younger leaders. It seems to be on revival. I don't think all of it is resolved, but it's very much on an upward trajectory. But most importantly, I think the fact that it had began to have ideological clarity, but also decided to mobilize and work with in a public way through those yatras, through kind of campaigning. But by the time the election came, they dominated the digital sphere. So, because the entire mainstream media had just kind of like, it was basically a kind of crazy love fest for Modi there. Everyone was competing to be more unctuous to him. But if you went on to, as it were, the digital space, it was Congress dominated, and other regional parties and even other influences dominated it. So I think they were a bit more savvy too. So they upped their game. So it wasn't simply idealism, if you see what I mean. They were quite strategic in their choice of candidates, they were very strategic in their use of the media. So I think it all came together for them after a very, very long time.
But when we talk about BJP on an international stage, on a platform, we talk about its ideology of Hindu nationalism. On the other side, when we have the Congress, there's always confusion about what is their ideology, what does Rahul Gandhi stand for. So, do we have an answer to that now? Would you
I
say?
think so. I mean, I do think he stands for India's diversity and pluralism. And I think he stands for equity because he's asked for caste census. So I would think this is a broad social justice program which does not deploy the older languages of simple liberalism, which can be quite technocratic or incredibly managerial, even. And it also speaks from the heart. As I said, it's deploying a kind of new emotional psychic vocabulary to counter the politics of authority and hate that have dominated India.
When we talk about Indian politics at large, in general, we haven't really looked at Muslim representation in Indian politics and the kind of targeted harassment they were facing, the marginalization they faced. Suddenly, I think it kind of dawned upon everybody that there isn't much representation for them in politics.
Yes, of course. I mean, the Indian Muslims lost out incredibly after partition. And this is the irony of it, because the majority of Muslims did not move. I mean, they chose India to be to be their home. So partition was not the way European states were constructed into the kind of ethnic cleansing that they saw. Not ethnic cleansing, but the borders around religions and yes, and even in wars, which did create ultimately over the centuries single religious nation states or linguistic states. Now, the Indian story was not that. The partition was brutal precisely because you had to move populations and people had killed. It was what I've called a civil war. It wasn't simply just kind of people going on a killing spree. It was a very political form of violence. But I think the Indian Constitution, again, to go back to the political settlement, decided that there could not be any special rights to Muslims. Yeah, and but I think we've come a long way since then, 7, 8 years down the road from it. But it's true that the 50s and 60s and the 70s, I think the post-partition story created a different kind of quietude, I would say, in Muslim politics. And I think it's really with the assertion of a Hindu first or Hindu nationalism with the Ram Temple that the Muslim question reappears as a main political question for India's polity in a new way. And since then, there's been also a continual deficit of political representation of Muslims.
Right. So I think it is to be seen what shape it takes now in the future. And
Yes, but I also think, I think Muslim questions are not just kind of communal questions. They're also questions about region. Muslims in Gujarat are not the same as Muslims in UP, and this is the thing, that the diversity of or Assam, so or Hyderabad, so they get, as it were, mediated through regional questions as well. And I think that's why it's been interesting that if there is now a kind of a coalition of wider regions and parties, which in India, which is really for the first time, because first time you have this kind of rainbow coalition. It's got a kind of agenda to ensure that the constitution is protected. So I think something will emerge. It will have to emerge, but also parties will have to attend to it. It won't just happen just like that.
so, in a previous episode of Lead, we had veteran Indian journalist Samar Halankar tell us that he's never felt more threatened in his 34 years of journalism as he does today. And the Modi and the BJP have been heavily criticized for shutting down public debate in India. So, what do you think? Now the impact of the results will have on the nature of public debate in the country, both in the media and through the courts.
I mean, I don't know. I think there's been initially a bit of an euphoria that the pall of suffocation seems to have lifted. But we'll have to find out because there are a couple of big ticket legislative agendas on the government. One is on the digital regulation of digital media. It's not simply about journalists or speakers outside in civil society. I think the big change is going to be that the parliament is going to be much more equal. There's actually going to be a set of debates taking place in parliament, and I think that will have an effect on the wider context. But it's very early days. I mean, at the moment, one can just say there's been a bit of a euphoria. But as I said, there's a digital bills that are going to come, but there's also the criminal law, the new criminal law code, which will require major pushback from the opposition if it's really serious about guaranteeing the rights and equity of people. But the ball is very much in the opposition's court, because I think India's very brave journalists have also done a stellar job for 10 years.
What do you think that international audiences, keeping the recent elections in mind, what do you think they should be thinking about Indian politics going forward?
That it's truly one of the world's most competitive democracies. That, I think, is number one. And this would also be a mistake to say that Hindu nationalism is gone. I mean, it still is the largest party in India. But the other point I would say was that, so I think it's India remains instructive for global democracy, because, in a way, I would say that that age of populism has come to an end. I think everyone is going to have to, the Congress has some ideas, but I think it's a big question on what the BJP is going to do. Uh, I would think, if you think about in terms of foreign politics, geopolitics and foreign policy, that's a separate matter. But in terms of what is going on politically, I would say yes, an absolute democratic churn. I think I would also summarize it as a real contest of ideas. For it is a real contest now for the future of India. So the future of India is going to be decided through a democratic contest.
This has been The Lead from New Lines magazine. You can find Shruti Kapila on X at Shruti Kapila, and you can buy her book, Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought in the Global Age online and at all good bookstores. If you want to go deeper on Indian history and politics, check out our recent episodes of The Lead and our recent essays on the New Lines website, linked in the show notes. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Surbhi Gupta. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please rate us and leave a review. It really helps us grow our audience. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again.